The security guard's hand was surprisingly gentle as he escorted me through the lobby of Meridian Technologies for the last time, past the gleaming awards display that showcased innovations I had personally developed over 2.5 decades of dedicated service. The irony wasn't lost on me that my employee badge, which had granted me access to some of the most sensitive research labs in the Pacific Northwest, was now being ceremoniously cut in half by the same HR representative who had hired me fresh out of MIT 24 years ago. But what made my blood turn to ice wasn't the public humiliation of being walked out like a common criminal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was the conversation I had overheard through the thin walls of the executive conference room just 30 minutes earlier, where CEO Jonathan Blackwood was casually discussing how my revolutionary biotech patent, worth an estimated $500 million, would be transferred to his golf partner's struggling pharmaceutical company for a fraction of its true value. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, and until this morning, I believed that merit, dedication, and scientific brilliance were enough to protect you in the corporate world. At 47 years old, I had spent the majority of my adult life climbing the ranks at Meridian Technologies, transforming from an eager young biochemist with a doctorate in molecular engineering into the company's most prolific patent holder and the director of their advanced research division. My laboratory had been my sanctuary, a place where complex problems yielded to systematic analysis and where breakthrough discoveries emerged from months of methodical experimentation. The walls of my office were lined with framed patents, each one representing years of research, countless late nights, and the kind of innovative thinking that had made Meridian Technologies a leader in biotechnology development. My personal life had taken a back seat to my scientific ambitions, a choice that had cost me 2 relationships and left me living alone in a meticulously organized condominium overlooking Elliott Bay in Seattle. I told myself that the sacrifice was worth it, that the groundbreaking research I was conducting would eventually benefit millions of people suffering from autoimmune disorders. My latest project, a revolutionary treatment protocol that could potentially cure multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and lupus, had consumed the last 4 years of my life and represented the culmination of everything I had learned about cellular regeneration and immune system modulation. The patent application for what I privately called the Chen protocol had been filed 6 months ago, and preliminary trials were showing results that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Patients who had been wheelchair-bound for years were walking again. Others who had suffered from debilitating pain and fatigue were returning to normal, productive lives. The pharmaceutical industry was buzzing with rumors about Meridian's breakthrough, and several major companies had already initiated preliminary discussions about licensing agreements that could generate unprecedented revenue streams. But this morning, everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for, was being stolen from me with the casual efficiency of a corporate restructuring announcement disguised as a performance review. The day had started normally enough. I arrived at the Meridian Technologies campus in Bellevue at 6:30 in the morning, as was my habit, to review the latest data from our clinical trials before the rest of my team arrived. The security guard, Marcus, had greeted me with his usual friendly wave, and I had badged into the research facility with the same sense of purpose that had driven me for over 2 decades. My laboratory was already humming with the quiet efficiency of automated equipment running overnight protocols, and I had settled into my office with a cup of coffee to analyze the most recent batch of patient data. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Patient after patient was showing dramatic improvement, with some cases demonstrating complete remission of symptoms that had plagued them for decades. The Chen protocol wasn't just another incremental advance in autoimmune treatment. It was a paradigm shift that could revolutionize medicine and generate billions of dollars in revenue for whatever company controlled the patent rights. I had been so absorbed in the data that I almost missed the email from HR requesting my immediate presence in Conference Room C for what was described as a routine performance evaluation and strategic planning session. The timing seemed odd, given that my annual review wasn't scheduled for another 3 months, but I assumed it was related to the patent application, or perhaps an early discussion about the commercial development of the Chen protocol. Walking through the corridors of Meridian Technologies that morning, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and anticipation. The walls were lined with photographs of breakthrough moments in the company's history, and I knew that my work would soon join those milestone achievements. Colleagues nodded respectfully as I passed, many of them aware that my research was on the verge of transforming not just our company's fortunes, but the entire field of autoimmune medicine. Conference Room C was located on the executive floor, a space I had visited countless times for patent reviews, budget discussions, and strategic planning meetings. As I approached the room, I could hear voices through the partially open door, and I recognized the distinctive laugh of CEO Jonathan Blackwood, a man whose rise to power had been built more on political maneuvering and golf course networking than on scientific understanding or business acumen. What I heard as I paused outside the conference room would haunt me for months to come. "The Chen woman has no idea what's coming," Blackwood was saying, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone discussing a minor administrative task. 24 years with the company, sure, but her research division has become too expensive to maintain, and frankly, her attitude toward commercial applications has been problematic. Scientists who think they know better than the business side always become liabilities eventually. Another voice, which I recognized as belonging to CFO Patricia Wong, responded with apparent concern. "Jonathan, she holds 17 patents that generate significant licensing revenue for us. Terminating her employment could create complications with our intellectual property portfolio, especially given her contributions to the Chen Protocol." Blackwood's laugh was dismissive and cold. "Patricia, you're thinking too narrowly about this. The Chen Protocol patent is filed under Meridian Technologies, not under her personal name. Once she's gone, we can restructure the intellectual property assignments however we see fit. In fact, I've already had preliminary discussions with Michael Harrison about transferring some of our biotech assets to PharmaCorp Solutions." The mention of Michael Harrison sent a chill through my entire body. Harrison was Blackwood's golf partner and frequent companion at various social events. A man whose pharmaceutical company had been struggling financially for years, despite repeated infusions of capital from questionable sources. PharmaCorp Solutions was known throughout the industry for acquiring promising research at below-market prices, and then rushing products to market without adequate testing or quality control. Michael's company could benefit tremendously from access to our autoimmune research, Blackwood continued, apparently oblivious to the ethical and legal implications of what he was proposing. "And given our long-standing friendship, I'm confident we can arrange a licensing agreement that would be mutually beneficial. The Chen Protocol alone could be worth $500 million in the right hands." My hands were shaking as I absorbed the magnitude of what I was hearing. The man who controlled my professional destiny was casually discussing the theft of my life's work, planning to hand over patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars to his personal friend for reasons that had nothing to do with scientific merit or fair market value. The Chen Protocol, which could potentially help millions of suffering patients, was being treated like a commodity to be traded for personal gain. Patricia Wong's voice carried a note of caution that suggested she understood the legal ramifications better than Blackwood did. "Jonathan, I need to remind you that intellectual property transfers of this magnitude require board approval and regulatory oversight. We can't simply reassign patents without proper documentation and justification." "Patricia, sometimes you worry too much about technicalities," Blackwood replied, with the confident dismissal of someone who believed that rules applied to other people. "The board trusts my judgment on strategic partnerships, and Michael Harrison's company has the commercial infrastructure to maximize the value of these patents. Chen will be gone by the end of the day, and once she's no longer an employee, her opinions about intellectual property assignments become irrelevant." The conversation continued, but I had heard enough to understand that my career at Meridian Technologies was about to end, not because of performance issues or budget constraints, but because my research had become too valuable for Jonathan Blackwood to allow me to maintain any influence over its development. The Chen Protocol, which represented 4 years of my life and potentially decades of benefit for patients suffering from autoimmune disorders, was being stolen from me through a combination of corporate manipulation and personal corruption. I backed away from the conference room door and made my way to the women's restroom, where I locked myself in a stall and tried to process the implications of what I had discovered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 24 years of loyalty, dedication, and scientific excellence were about to be discarded because my boss wanted to enrich his golf partner at the expense of proper research development and patient welfare. The woman staring back at me in the restroom mirror looked older than her 47 years, with stress lines around her eyes that spoke to decades of working 80-hour weeks and sacrificing personal relationships for professional achievement. My dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in the efficient ponytail I had worn to work every day for the past decade. I had always prided myself on my professional appearance and competent demeanor, but in that moment, I looked like what I was about to become, a middle-aged scientist whose career had been destroyed by corporate greed and personal betrayal. Returning to conference room C 15 minutes later required every ounce of professional composure I had developed over my career. Blackwood and Wong were seated at the polished mahogany table, along with HR Director Jennifer Mills, whose expression suggested she was about to deliver news that she found personally distasteful but professionally necessary. Dr. Chen, Blackwood said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat. We have some important organizational changes to discuss with you." I settled into the leather chair across from them, my hands folded calmly in my lap despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Having overheard their conversation, I knew exactly what was coming, but I was determined to maintain my dignity and gather as much information as possible about their plans for my research. As you know, Blackwood continued, Meridian Technologies is constantly evolving to meet the challenges of an increasingly competitive marketplace. We've been conducting a comprehensive review of our research and development operations, with particular attention to cost efficiency and commercial viability. The corporate speak was familiar and predictable, the kind of language that companies use to justify decisions that had already been made for reasons they couldn't publicly acknowledge. I had heard similar presentations countless times during budget meetings and strategic planning sessions, but I had never imagined that I would be on the receiving end of such calculated corporate manipulation. "Your research division," Wong interjected, consulting notes that had obviously been prepared in advance, "while scientifically impressive, has been operating at a significant cost relative to immediate revenue generation. The board has determined that we need to restructure our research priorities to focus on projects with shorter development timelines and more predictable market outcomes." The irony was staggering. My research division had generated more patent revenue for Meridian Technologies than any other department in the company's history. The Chen protocol alone was projected to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing fees, yet they were characterizing my work as financially problematic because it didn't fit their preferred timeline for commercial exploitation. "I see," I said carefully, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. "And how does this restructuring affect my position and my ongoing research projects?" Jennifer Mills cleared her throat and opened a folder containing documents that had clearly been prepared before this meeting was even scheduled. "Dr. Chen, effective immediately, your position as Director of Advanced Research is being eliminated as part of our organizational streamlining. We're offering you a generous severance package that includes 18 months of salary continuation and comprehensive healthcare coverage. 18 months of salary for 24 years of service and intellectual property worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The mathematical absurdity of the offer was almost as insulting as the casual way it was being presented. "What happens to my research projects?" I asked, though I already knew the answer based on what I had overheard. Specifically, what happens to the Chen protocol and the other patents currently in development? Blackwood's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of the calculating intelligence that had enabled his rise to corporate leadership. "All intellectual property developed during your employment with Meridian Technologies remains the property of the company, as specified in your original employment agreement. We'll be transitioning your research projects to other team members and exploring various commercial partnerships to maximize their value." The phrase commercial partnerships was clearly a euphemism for the corrupt deal he was planning with Michael Harrison, but I wasn't supposed to know about those discussions. I was expected to accept the termination gracefully, sign the severance agreement, and disappear quietly while my life's work was handed over to a man whose only qualification was his friendship with my former boss. "I'd like to review the severance agreement before making any decisions," I said, extending my hand for the documents. "This is obviously a significant change, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications." Jennifer Mills handed me a thick folder containing legal documents that had been crafted to protect Meridian Technologies, while offering me minimal compensation for the intellectual property I was being forced to abandon. The non-compete clauses were particularly restrictive, essentially preventing me from working in autoimmune research for any competing company for a period of 3 years. "Of course," Mills said with practiced sympathy, "take all the time you need to review the materials. However, we do need your decision by the end of the business day, and security will need to escort you from the building regardless of whether you sign the agreement." The timeline was deliberately aggressive, designed to prevent me from consulting with attorneys or conducting any research into the legal implications of what they were demanding. They wanted me gone quickly and quietly, before I could discover the full extent of their plans or take any action to protect my intellectual property rights. "I understand," I replied, gathering the documents and standing to leave. "I'll have an answer for you by 5 o'clock. Walking back to my laboratory for what I now knew would be the last time, I felt a profound sense of loss that went beyond mere career disappointment. The research projects scattered across my desk represented years of methodical investigation, careful hypothesis development, and breakthrough discoveries that could genuinely improve millions of lives. The Chen Protocol, in particular, had been my obsession for the past 4 years, a project that had consumed virtually every waking hour and had finally begun showing the miraculous results I had dreamed of achieving. My laboratory had been my second home, a space where I felt completely competent and in control. The sophisticated equipment that lined the walls had been carefully selected and calibrated to support the kind of cutting-edge research that distinguished Meridian Technologies from its competitors. The graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who worked under my supervision trusted my judgment implicitly and had contributed their own brilliant insights to projects that were advancing the boundaries of medical science. Now all of that was being taken away from me, not because of scientific failure or performance problems, but because my research had become too valuable for Jonathan Blackwood to allow me to maintain any influence over its development and commercialization. I spent the next 3 hours carefully documenting my research projects, downloading critical data files to encrypted drives, and preparing detailed notes that would help my successor understand the complex methodologies I had developed over years of experimental refinement. If my work was going to be continued without me, I was determined to ensure that the science remained sound and that patient welfare remained the primary consideration. The Chen Protocol files were particularly comprehensive, containing not just experimental data but also extensive notes about potential side effects, optimal dosing protocols, and patient selection criteria that had been developed through careful analysis of hundreds of trial participants. This information would be crucial for anyone attempting to commercialize the treatment, and I wasn't about to let corporate greed compromise the safety and efficacy of a breakthrough that could transform autoimmune medicine. As I worked, my mind was already beginning to formulate a response to what had been done to me. 24 years in the biotech industry had taught me that intellectual property law was complex, and that corporations often made mistakes when they assumed that employment agreements gave them unlimited rights to employee innovations. The Chen Protocol had been developed using my own theoretical framework, building on research I had begun during my graduate studies, and utilizing methodologies I had refined through decades of independent investigation. More importantly, I had meticulously documented the development process, maintaining detailed laboratory notebooks that clearly established my role as the primary inventor and the timeline of discovery that led to the breakthrough results. Patent law was very specific about inventor rights, and companies that attempted to reassign intellectual property without proper legal justification often found themselves facing expensive litigation and potentially devastating financial judgments. By 4 o'clock, I had completed my documentation and backup procedures, ensuring that my legitimate research interests were protected regardless of what corporate decisions were made about my employment status. I had also begun researching intellectual property attorneys who specialized in biotech patent disputes, identifying several firms with strong track records of protecting inventor rights against corporate overreach. The meeting with HR to deliver my decision was scheduled for 5 o'clock, but I had no intention of signing any agreement that would prevent me from challenging the theft of my intellectual property. Instead, I would be using the time between now and tomorrow morning to consult with legal counsel and begin developing a strategy for protecting the Chen Protocol and ensuring that it reached patients through legitimate commercial channels, rather than through corrupt deals designed to enrich Jonathan Blackwood's personal associates. Walking back to conference room C at exactly 5 o'clock, I carried myself with the dignity and composure that had characterized my entire professional career. The severance agreement remained unsigned in my briefcase, and my decision about how to respond to Meridian Technologies' betrayal had been made with the same methodical precision I applied to complex research problems. "Dr. Chen," Jennifer Mills said as I entered the room, "have you had a chance to review the severance agreement? Do you have any questions about the terms we're offering?" "I have reviewed the documents thoroughly," I replied, placing the unsigned agreement on the conference table. "However, I have significant concerns about the intellectual property provisions and the non-compete restrictions. I'll need additional time to consult with legal counsel before making any commitments." Blackwood's expression darkened, revealing irritation that his carefully orchestrated plan wasn't proceeding as smoothly as he had anticipated. "Dr. Chen, I hope you understand that refusing to sign the severance agreement doesn't change the fundamental situation. Your employment with Meridian Technologies is terminated effective immediately, and all company property, including intellectual property, remains under corporate control." His confidence was based on assumptions about employment law and patent ownership that might not withstand careful legal scrutiny, but he clearly believed that a terminated employee would lack the resources and determination to challenge corporate decisions. He was about to discover how wrong he was about Dr. Sarah Chen. "I understand the situation perfectly," I said with calm precision. "I also understand my rights under federal patent law and the legal protections available to inventors whose work is being misappropriated. I'll be in touch with my attorney regarding the next steps." The security escort from the building was handled with professional courtesy, but the symbolism was unmistakable. I was being removed from the company where I had devoted my entire adult career, carrying only a small box of personal items, while leaving behind research projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The patents that bore my name would remain under Meridian Technologies' control, and the Chen protocol would likely be handed over to Michael Harrison's company within a matter of weeks. But as I walked through the lobby for the last time, passing the display of innovations I had helped create, I felt something other than defeat or despair. I felt the same focused determination that had driven me through doctoral studies, through decades of complex research challenges, and through the breakthrough discoveries that had established my reputation as one of the most innovative scientists in autoimmune medicine. Jonathan Blackwood had made the mistake of assuming that terminating my employment would eliminate me as a threat to his corrupt plans. He was about to learn that Dr. Sarah Chen was far more dangerous as an adversary than she had ever been as an employee, and that stealing intellectual property from someone who understood patent law better than he understood golf was a catastrophic miscalculation. The woman who walked out of Meridian Technologies that evening was not the same person who had arrived that morning with naive faith in corporate loyalty and scientific meritocracy. I was someone who had been awakened to the realities of corporate power and personal betrayal, someone who possessed both the knowledge and the determination to fight back against theft and corruption. My career at Meridian Technologies was over, but my battle for the Chen Protocol was just beginning. And unlike Jonathan Blackwood, I had never learned to accept defeat gracefully. The law offices of Henderson, Kravitz & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in downtown Seattle, their reception area decorated with framed newspaper articles celebrating victories against some of the largest corporations in America. As I sat in the mahogany-paneled waiting room at 8 o'clock the following morning, clutching a briefcase filled with 24 years' worth of research documentation, I felt the weight of the decision I had made during a sleepless night of analyzing my options and researching intellectual property law. Attorney David Henderson appeared exactly as his online biography had suggested he would. A man in his early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of intense focus that came from 3 decades of fighting corporate giants on behalf of inventors and whistleblowers. His handshake was firm, his office was lined with legal precedents and patent law textbooks, and his initial questions demonstrated an understanding of biotech intellectual property issues that immediately put me at ease. "Dr. Chen," he said as we settled into leather chairs beside a conference table that had clearly hosted countless strategy sessions. "I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided in your phone call last night. Before we discuss legal options, I want to understand exactly what happened at Meridian Technologies and what evidence you have to support your claims. I opened my briefcase and began spreading documents across the table with the same methodical precision I had used in laboratory experiments for over 2 decades. Laboratory notebooks dating back 4 years chronicled every stage of the Chen protocol's development, from initial theoretical framework through experimental design, clinical trials, and breakthrough results. Patent applications bore my name as primary inventor, supported by detailed technical specifications that clearly established my role in creating the revolutionary treatment. The Chen protocol began as an extension of research I initiated during my doctoral studies at MIT, I explained, pointing to early theoretical papers I had published in peer-reviewed journals. The foundational concepts were developed entirely through my own investigation, building on hypotheses I had been exploring for over 15 years before joining Meridian Technologies. Henderson studied the documentation with the focused attention of someone who understood both the scientific complexity and the legal implications of what I was presenting. Patent law was very specific about inventor rights, and corporations that attempted to claim ownership of innovations developed primarily through employee research often found themselves facing challenges they hadn't anticipated. The employment agreement you signed with Meridian Technologies, Henderson said, consulting the contract I had provided, contains standard intellectual property assignment clauses, but these provisions are subject to federal patent law and inventor protection statutes. If you can demonstrate that the Chen protocol represents a continuation of your independent research rather than work for hire development, we may have grounds for challenging their ownership claims. The implications were more promising than I had dared to hope. While my employment contract did assign certain rights to Meridian Technologies, patent law provided protections for inventors whose work predated their corporate employment or represented significant independent contribution beyond company resources and direction. More importantly, Henderson continued, if Meridian Technologies attempts to transfer your patents to another company without proper legal justification, particularly if that transfer appears to involve personal favoritism rather than legitimate business considerations, we could have grounds for both intellectual property theft and breach of fiduciary duty claims. I spent the next 2 hours providing Henderson with detailed explanations of the Chen protocol's development process, the clinical trial results that had generated such industry excitement, and the overheard conversation that had revealed Jonathan Blackwood's plans to transfer my patents to his Gulf Partners pharmaceutical company. The attorney took extensive notes, occasionally asking technical questions that demonstrated his familiarity with biotech patent disputes. Dr. Chen, based on what you've told me and the documentation you've provided, I believe we have a strong case for challenging Meridian's ownership claims and preventing any unauthorized transfer of your intellectual property, Henderson said as our meeting concluded. However, I want you to understand that corporate patent litigation can be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Companies like Meridian Technologies have significant legal resources, and they won't hesitate to use every available strategy to protect their interests. His warning was sobering but not surprising. I had spent enough time in corporate environments to understand that challenging established power structures required both determination and resources that many inventors simply didn't possess. But unlike most employees who found themselves in similar situations, I had 24 years of industry connections, substantial personal savings, and most importantly, ironclad documentation of my role in developing breakthrough medical technology. Mr. Henderson, I appreciate your candor about the challenges ahead, I replied, gathering my documents with renewed determination. But I want you to understand something about my situation. The Chen protocol isn't just intellectual property to me. It's a treatment that could help millions of people suffering from autoimmune disorders, and I won't allow it to be corrupted by corporate greed or handed over to an unqualified company for personal gain. Henderson's smile suggested that he had heard similar declarations from clients before, but that my combination of scientific credentials and documented evidence made my case more promising than most. In that case, Dr. Chen, let's discuss strategy. Our first priority will be filing an immediate injunction to prevent any transfer of your patents, while we prepare a comprehensive challenge to Meridian's ownership claims. The legal strategy session that followed was more complex and encouraging than I had anticipated. Henderson explained that patent law provided several avenues for challenging corporate ownership claims, particularly when inventors could demonstrate that their innovations represented independent research or significant personal contribution beyond their employment duties. The Chen Protocol's development history, meticulously documented in my laboratory notebooks, provided exactly the kind of evidence that could support such challenges. We'll be filing multiple legal actions simultaneously, Henderson explained, outlining a strategy that would attack Meridian Technologies from several directions. First, we'll seek an emergency injunction preventing any transfer or licensing of the Chen Protocol patents, while ownership disputes are resolved. Second, we'll file a formal challenge to their ownership claims, based on your role as primary inventor and the independent nature of your research. Third, if they proceed with transferring patents to PharmaCorp Solutions, we'll file additional claims for breach of fiduciary duty and potential fraud. The comprehensiveness of the legal strategy was both reassuring and sobering. Henderson's firm clearly had experience with complex patent disputes and understood the tactics that corporations use to maintain control over valuable intellectual property. More importantly, they had a track record of success in cases where individual inventors challenged large companies with significant legal resources. Leaving Henderson's office that morning, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination that had been missing since my termination from Meridian Technologies. The legal battle ahead would be challenging and expensive, but I finally had a clear path forward and professional allies who understood both the scientific and legal complexities of my situation. My next stop was the downtown branch of Pacific Northwest Bank, where I had maintained accounts for over 15 years, and where my relationship manager had helped me accumulate substantial savings through careful investment of patent royalties and consulting fees. 24 years of living modestly while focusing on research had resulted in a financial position that could support extended legal action, particularly if Henderson's firm was confident enough about my case to work on a contingency basis. Dr. Chen, said Patricia Morrison, the investment advisor who had been managing my portfolio for the past decade, I was surprised to hear about your departure from Meridian Technologies. Given your track record and the value of your research, I assumed you would be there until retirement. Morrison's surprise was understandable, given that my financial planning had been based on continued employment and growing patent royalties from innovations developed at Meridian Technologies. My termination represented a significant disruption to long-term financial projections. But it also freed up resources that could be devoted to protecting my intellectual property rights. The situation is more complicated than a simple career change, I explained, providing Morrison with a general overview of the patent disputes and legal actions I was planning to pursue. I'm going to need access to significant funds for legal fees and living expenses, while I challenge Meridian's ownership claims and work to establish an independent research operation. Morrison's expression grew more serious as she absorbed the implications of what I was describing. Patent litigation was notoriously expensive and unpredictable, with cases sometimes extending for years before reaching resolution. However, my financial position was strong enough to support extended legal action, particularly if I was careful about managing expenses and realistic about timeline expectations. Based on your current portfolio and savings, Morrison said, consulting financial records that reflected years of careful planning and conservative spending, you have sufficient resources to support legal action for at least 2 years, possibly longer, if we adjust your investment strategy to prioritize liquidity over growth. The financial security was crucial for the strategy I was beginning to formulate. Unlike most employees who found themselves in patent disputes with former employers, I had the resources necessary to pursue comprehensive legal action without being forced into premature settlements by financial pressure. This advantage would be critical in the months ahead, as corporate legal teams often relied on economic warfare to discourage individual inventors from challenging ownership claims. My afternoon was devoted to research that went far beyond legal strategies and financial planning. If I was going to challenge Meridian Technologies successfully, I needed to understand not just the law, but also the corporate culture and business relationships that had enabled Jonathan Blackwood's planned theft of my intellectual property. The Seattle business community was relatively small and interconnected, particularly in the biotech sector, and information about corporate dealings often circulated through professional networks long before becoming public knowledge. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, my former colleague from MIT, who now directed the biotech research program at the University of Washington, had agreed to meet for coffee at a quiet cafe near the campus. Elizabeth and I had maintained professional contact for over a decade, and her position in academic research gave her insights into industry developments that weren't always visible to corporate employees. "Sarah, I heard through the grapevine that you're no longer with Meridian," Elizabeth said as we settled into a corner table away from other customers. "Given your track record and the excitement about your autoimmune research, I assumed there must be more to the story than a simple departure." Elizabeth's intuition was correct, and her academic position meant that she could be trusted with confidential information about corporate misconduct without risking her own professional relationships. I provided her with a detailed explanation of the events that had led to my termination and the overheard conversation that had revealed Blackwood's plans to transfer my patents to PharmaCorp Solutions. "Sarah, what you're describing sounds like a classic case of corporate theft disguised as intellectual property management," Elizabeth said, her expression reflecting both sympathy and professional outrage. "But I have to tell you, Jonathan Blackwood's relationship with Michael Harrison has been a subject of speculation in academic circles for several years. This was exactly the kind of industry intelligence I had been hoping to gather." Elizabeth's position gave her access to informal networks where university researchers, industry scientists, and regulatory officials shared observations about corporate behavior that wouldn't appear in official publications or business journals. "Harrison's company has been struggling financially for years," Elizabeth continued, lowering her voice to ensure our conversation remained private. "But they've managed to survive through a series of licensing deals that seem disproportionately favorable given their track record. There have been persistent rumors about preferential treatment from certain corporate partners, though nothing has ever been formally investigated." The information was consistent with what I had observed about PharmaCorp Solutions during my research into potential competitors and licensing partners. Harrison's company had a reputation for acquiring promising research at below-market prices and then rushing products to market without adequate testing or quality control. The prospect of my carefully developed Chen protocol being subjected to such treatment was professionally offensive and potentially dangerous for patients who could benefit from proper development. "Elizabeth, do you know anything specific about PharmaCorp's regulatory relationships or their history with the FDA?" I asked, recognizing that regulatory issues could provide additional leverage in my legal strategy. "That's where things get particularly interesting," Elizabeth replied, consulting notes she had apparently prepared for our meeting. "PharmaCorp has had several compliance issues over the past 5 years, including warnings about inadequate clinical trial protocols and questions about data integrity in their patent applications. They're definitely not the kind of company that should be trusted with breakthrough medical research. This regulatory history could prove crucial for my legal case. If Meridian Technologies proceeded with transferring my patents to a company with documented compliance problems, it could constitute a breach of their fiduciary duty to shareholders and a violation of their responsibility to ensure that medical innovations were developed safely and effectively." Our conversation continued for over an hour, with Elizabeth providing insights into industry dynamics and regulatory issues that would be valuable for both my legal strategy and my long-term planning. Her academic network included researchers at regulatory agencies, former pharmaceutical executives, and current industry scientists who might be willing to provide expert testimony about proper patent development and transfer procedures. "Sarah, there's one more thing you should know," Elizabeth said as our meeting concluded. "I've heard rumors that several major pharmaceutical companies have been quietly investigating the possibility of poaching top researchers from smaller biotech firms. Your termination from Meridian might actually represent an opportunity to align with a company that would properly value your research and provide adequate resources for continued development." The suggestion was intriguing and represented a potential path forward that I hadn't fully considered. While my immediate priority was protecting the Chen protocol from corrupt transfer to PharmaCorp Solutions, my long-term goals involved continuing research and ensuring that my innovations reached patients who could benefit from them. Aligning with a legitimate pharmaceutical company could provide both resources and regulatory expertise necessary for proper commercialization. That evening, I began researching major pharmaceutical companies that might be interested in autoimmune research and that had reputations for ethical business practices and proper treatment of intellectual property. Companies like Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and Roche had extensive experience with complex medical research and the resources necessary to bring breakthrough treatments to market through proper regulatory channels. My investigation into potential corporate partners was interrupted by a phone call from an unexpected source. Dr. Michael Torres, whom I recognized as one of the leading researchers in autoimmune medicine at Johns Hopkins University, had somehow learned about my departure from Meridian Technologies and was calling to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. Dr. Chen, I hope you don't mind the unsolicited contact, Torres said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who was genuinely excited about scientific possibilities. I've been following your research for several years, and when I heard about your situation at Meridian, I wanted to reach out about some opportunities that might interest you. Torres's reputation in autoimmune research was impeccable, and his work on cellular regeneration had been foundational for several breakthroughs in the field. His interest in my research was both professionally flattering and strategically significant, suggesting that the scientific community was aware of the Chen protocol's potential and concerned about its proper development. I appreciate your interest, Drive, Torres, I replied, recognizing that this conversation could represent an important development in my strategy. What kind of opportunities are you thinking about? The National Institutes of Health has been discussing the possibility of establishing a new research center focused specifically on autoimmune disorders, Torres explained. They're looking for researchers with proven track records and innovative approaches to serve as founding investigators. Your work on cellular regeneration and immune system modulation would be perfect for this kind of program. The NIH opportunity was intriguing for several reasons. Federal research positions would provide both resources and independence necessary for continued investigation, while also offering protection from corporate interference and intellectual property disputes. If I could establish an independent research program with government backing, it would provide leverage in my legal battles with Meridian Technologies and demonstrate that legitimate scientific institutions valued my work. Dr. Torres, that sounds like exactly the kind of opportunity I should explore, I said, feeling a surge of optimism about possibilities that extended beyond legal battles and corporate conflicts. How would I go about pursuing consideration for this program? I'd be happy to make introductions to the NIH administrators who are developing the program, Torres replied. Given your publication record and patent portfolio, I think you would be a very attractive candidate. The federal research environment might also provide some protection from the corporate disputes you're apparently dealing with. The conversation with Torres lasted for over an hour, covering both the NIH opportunity and broader issues related to autoimmune research funding and regulatory development. His insights into federal research programs and academic collaboration possibilities provided me with a clearer vision of how I could continue my work independently while challenging Meridian Technologies' theft of my intellectual property. By the end of the evening, I had compiled extensive notes about legal strategies, financial resources, industry intelligence, and career opportunities that painted a comprehensive picture of my options and priorities. The legal battle with Meridian Technologies would be challenging and expensive, but I now had professional allies, financial resources, and alternative career paths that would allow me to pursue justice while continuing my research. The woman who had been escorted from Meridian Technologies just 24 hours earlier was already transforming into someone more strategic and better connected than Jonathan Blackwood could have anticipated. His assumption that terminating my employment would eliminate me as a threat to his corrupt plans was proving to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Over the next several days, I methodically implemented the strategy that had emerged from my consultations with legal counsel, financial advisors, and scientific colleagues. Henderson's firm filed an emergency injunction to prevent any transfer of the Chen protocol patents while ownership disputes were resolved, a legal action that immediately complicated Blackwood's plans and bought time for more comprehensive challenges. The injunction filing was accompanied by detailed documentation of my role in developing the Chen protocol, including laboratory notebooks that clearly established the timeline of discovery and the independent nature of my research. Patent law was very specific about inventor rights, and my documentation provided exactly the kind of evidence that could support challenges to corporate ownership claims. Meridian Technologies' response to the legal action was swift and predictably aggressive. Their corporate legal team, led by a prominent Seattle law firm, filed motions to dismiss the injunction and characterized my claims as the bitter reactions of a terminated employee seeking to damage her former employer. Their strategy was clearly designed to portray me as an unreliable adversary whose allegations were motivated by personal grievance rather than legitimate legal concerns. But Henderson had anticipated this approach and had prepared responses that focused on the documented evidence rather than emotional arguments about corporate misconduct. Patent law disputes were ultimately decided based on technical evidence and legal precedent, not on corporate characterizations of employee motivations or character assessments. Dr. Chen, Henderson said during our strategy meeting following Meridian's initial legal response, their reaction is exactly what we expected and actually strengthens our position. By characterizing your claims as frivolous, they're essentially arguing that a researcher with your credentials and documentation would fabricate evidence about intellectual property development. That's a very difficult position for them to defend. The legal maneuvering continued for several weeks, with both sides filing motions and countermotions, while the federal court considered the merits of the emergency injunction. During this period, I continued gathering intelligence about PharmaCorp Solutions and its relationship with Jonathan Blackwood, building a case that would demonstrate the corrupt nature of the planned patent transfer. My investigation into PharmaCorp's regulatory history revealed even more serious problems than Elizabeth Warren had initially suggested. The company had received multiple FDA warnings about inadequate clinical trial protocols, and 2 of their recent drug applications had been rejected due to questions about data integrity and patient safety. The prospect of transferring my carefully developed Chen protocol to such a company represented not just personal theft, but potential endangerment of patients who could benefit from proper treatment development. More disturbing was the evidence I uncovered about the financial relationship between Blackwood and Harrison. Corporate records revealed that Blackwood had invested personally in PharmaCorp Solutions, creating a clear conflict of interest that should have been disclosed to Meridian's board of directors and shareholders. His planned transfer of valuable patents to a company in which he held personal financial interests constituted a breach of fiduciary duty that could expose both him and Meridian Technologies to significant legal liability. This information was crucial for expanding my legal strategy beyond simple patent ownership disputes. Henderson's firm prepared additional filings that challenged not just Meridian's ownership claims, but also the ethical and legal legitimacy of their planned patent transfers. Corporate directors who used their positions to enrich companies in which they held personal interests were violating fundamental principles of corporate governance and shareholder protection. The complexity of the legal case was matched by the intensity of the scientific opportunity that was developing through my contact with Dr. Torres and the NIH research program. Federal administrators had reviewed my publication record and patent portfolio with enthusiasm, and preliminary discussions suggested that I could be offered a senior research position with substantial funding and independence. Dr. Chen, said Dr. Jennifer Kim, the NIH program director who was coordinating the new autoimmune research center, your work on cellular regeneration represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we want to support. We're prepared to offer you a position as a principal investigator with a multi-year funding commitment that would allow you to continue developing your treatment protocols. The NIH opportunity represented more than just career security. It provided a platform for continuing my research while maintaining independence from corporate interference and intellectual property disputes. Federal research positions carried certain protections and resources that would allow me to pursue scientific goals without concern for commercial pressures or corrupt business relationships. Dr. Kim, I'm very interested in the NIH position, I replied, recognizing that accepting federal research funding could strengthen my legal position while providing the resources necessary for continued innovation. What would be the timeline for finalizing this appointment? We could have formal offers prepared within 2 weeks, Kim said, consulting notes about budget allocations and administrative procedures. The Autoimmune Research Center is a high priority for the Institute, and we're eager to begin recruiting investigators with your qualifications and track record. The combination of aggressive legal action and attractive career alternatives was beginning to create pressure on Meridian Technologies that they clearly hadn't anticipated. Their initial strategy of simply dismissing my claims and proceeding with patent transfers was becoming complicated by both federal court intervention and the prospect that I would continue my research under government auspices. But the most significant development in my expanding strategy came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Valdez, whom I recognized as a former Meridian Technologies researcher who had left the company several years earlier, contacted me with information that would fundamentally change the nature of my legal case. Dr. Chen, I heard about your situation through professional networks, Valdez said during a confidential phone conversation. I want you to know that what happened to you is part of a pattern at Meridian Technologies. Several researchers have had their patents transferred to companies with connections to senior executives, usually after their employment was terminated for questionable reasons. This revelation transformed my case from an individual dispute into evidence of systematic corporate misconduct that could expose Meridian Technologies to far more serious legal consequences than simple patent ownership challenges. If the company had been engaging in a pattern of terminating researchers and transferring their intellectual property to connected companies, it could constitute a criminal conspiracy that would attract federal investigation. Dr. Valdez, would you be willing to provide testimony about these patterns? I asked, recognizing that corroborating evidence from other affected researchers could be crucial for building a comprehensive case. Absolutely, Valdez replied without hesitation. What they're doing is wrong, and it's damaging to the entire scientific community. Researchers who make breakthrough discoveries shouldn't have their work stolen by corporate executives looking to enrich their personal associates. The conversation with Valdez continued for over an hour, with her providing detailed information about other cases where Meridian Technologies had allegedly transferred valuable patents to companies with questionable qualifications and suspicious connections to senior executives. The pattern of misconduct was extensive and well documented, suggesting that my situation was part of a larger system of corporate corruption that had been operating for several years. This evidence would allow Henderson's firm to expand our legal strategy significantly, moving beyond individual patent disputes to challenge the entire pattern of misconduct at Meridian Technologies. Companies that engaged in systematic theft of employee intellectual property faced not just civil litigation, but potential criminal prosecution and federal investigation that could result in massive financial penalties and criminal charges against responsible executives. The prospect of exposing Jonathan Blackwood's entire corrupt system was both professionally satisfying and strategically advantageous. Rather than simply fighting to protect my own intellectual property, I was now positioned to lead a comprehensive challenge to corporate misconduct that could benefit numerous researchers and protect the integrity of scientific innovation in the biotech industry. As I prepared for the next phase of legal action, I felt a profound sense of transformation that went far beyond simple career change or professional disappointment. The woman who had been casually dismissed and escorted from Meridian Technologies was becoming someone far more strategic and dangerous than anyone at the company had anticipated. Jonathan Blackwood had assumed that terminating my employment would eliminate me as a threat to his corrupt plans. Instead, his theft of my intellectual property had awakened capabilities and connections that would ultimately expose his entire system of misconduct and demonstrate that underestimating Dr. Sarah Chen was the greatest mistake of his corporate career. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that accompanied high-stakes corporate litigation, as attorneys from 3 different firms gathered in the marble-lined corridors outside Judge Margaret Sullivan's courtroom. I arrived precisely at 8:30 that Tuesday morning, carrying a briefcase filled with documentation that would either validate my claims against Meridian Technologies or mark the end of my career in biotech research. The emergency injunction hearing that was about to begin would determine whether my Chen protocol patents could be transferred to PharmaCorp Solutions, while ownership disputes remained unresolved. Henderson had prepared me extensively for this moment, explaining that federal judges were typically skeptical of corporate intellectual property claims that appeared to involve personal relationships rather than legitimate business considerations. Judge Sullivan, in particular, had a reputation for asking pointed questions about the motivations behind patent transfers and the qualifications of receiving companies. If Meridian Technologies couldn't provide convincing justification for their planned deal with Michael Harrison's struggling pharmaceutical company, the injunction would remain in place while we pursued comprehensive legal challenges. The courtroom filled rapidly with observers from the Seattle biotech community, including several former colleagues who had heard about the case through professional networks. Dr. Patricia Valdez sat in the third row, prepared to provide testimony about the pattern of misconduct at Meridian Technologies if Judge Sullivan decided to hear evidence beyond the initial legal arguments. Her presence represented the transformation of my individual dispute into something larger and more threatening to corporate executives who had assumed their activities would remain hidden from public scrutiny. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Sullivan," announced the bailiff as the proceedings began. Judge Sullivan was a woman in her early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she had little patience for corporate legal maneuvering, designed to obscure rather than illuminate the truth. Her reputation for cutting through complex patent disputes to focus on fundamental questions of ownership and inventor rights had made her both respected and feared by corporate legal teams throughout the Pacific Northwest. Henderson rose to present our arguments with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. His opening statement focused not on emotional appeals about corporate betrayal, but on documented evidence of my role in developing the Chen Protocol and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Meridian Technologies' planned patent transfer. "Your Honor," Henderson began, consulting notes that outlined our comprehensive legal strategy. Dr. Sarah Chen spent 4 years developing revolutionary autoimmune treatments that represent genuine breakthroughs in medical science. The Chen Protocol, which is the subject of these proceedings, was developed primarily through her independent research, building on theoretical frameworks she had established during her graduate studies and refined through decades of investigation. The legal argument was supported by extensive documentation that clearly established my role as the primary inventor and the independent nature of my research. Laboratory notebooks dating back to my MIT doctoral work showed the evolution of ideas that had ultimately led to the Chen Protocol, while publication records demonstrated my consistent contributions to autoimmune research long before joining Meridian Technologies. "More troubling, Your Honor," Henderson continued, "is the evidence suggesting that Meridian Technologies terminated Drive Chen's employment specifically to facilitate the transfer of her patents to PharmaCorp Solutions, a company owned by CEO Jonathan Blackwood's personal golf partner. This transfer appears to be motivated by personal relationships rather than legitimate business considerations, and it involves a receiving company with documented regulatory problems and questionable qualifications." Judge Sullivan's expression grew more serious as Henderson outlined the evidence of corporate misconduct and the potential consequences for medical research if valuable patents were transferred to unqualified companies for corrupt purposes. Patent law was designed to protect both inventors and the public interest, ensuring that breakthrough innovations were developed properly and made available to patients who could benefit from them. Meridian Technologies' legal response was presented by senior partner Robert Kim from one of Seattle's most prestigious corporate law firms. Kim's strategy was clearly designed to characterize my claims as the vindictive reactions of a terminated employee seeking to damage her former employer through frivolous litigation. His presentation focused on standard employment contract language and attempted to minimize the significance of my individual contributions to research that was conducted using company resources. "Your Honor," Kim argued, consulting documents that had obviously been prepared to support Meridian's ownership claims. Dr. Chen was employed by Meridian Technologies for 24 years, during which time she was provided with laboratory facilities, research funding, and technical support that enabled her investigations. The intellectual property she developed during this employment rightfully belongs to the company, as specified in standard industry employment agreements. The corporate legal strategy was predictable but potentially effective if Judge Sullivan was unfamiliar with the complexities of biotech patent law and inventor rights. Many employment contracts contained broad intellectual property assignment clauses that seemed to give companies unlimited rights to employee innovations. But federal patent law provided specific protections for inventors whose work represented independent research or significant personal contribution beyond their employment duties. Henderson had anticipated this approach and was prepared with responses that focused on the technical evidence rather than contractual interpretations that might favor corporate interests. Patent disputes were ultimately decided based on documented invention processes and the specific contributions of named inventors, not on general employment agreement language that might conflict with federal intellectual property protections. "Your Honor," Henderson responded during his rebuttal presentation. Employment contracts cannot override federal patent law or eliminate inventor rights that are specifically protected by statute. Dr. Chen's laboratory notebooks clearly document that the Chen Protocol represents a continuation of research she began during graduate school, building on theoretical frameworks she developed independently over more than 15 years of investigation. The technical evidence was comprehensive and compelling. My research had followed a clear trajectory from graduate school through postdoctoral work and into my corporate employment, with the Chen Protocol representing the culmination of ideas and methodologies I had been developing throughout my entire career. While Meridian Technologies had provided resources and facilities, the fundamental innovations were clearly attributable to my individual expertise and theoretical insights. Judge Sullivan asked several pointed questions about the timeline of patent development and the specific circumstances surrounding my termination from Meridian Technologies. Her inquiries suggested that she was particularly interested in the relationship between Jonathan Blackwood and Michael Harrison, and whether the planned patent transfer represented legitimate business strategy or personal favoritism that could constitute breach of fiduciary duty. Mr. Kim, Judge Sullivan said, addressing Meridian's attorney with the kind of direct questioning that corporate lawyers typically tried to avoid. Can you explain why your client believes that transferring valuable medical patents to a company with documented regulatory problems serves the interests of shareholders and patients who could benefit from proper development of these treatments? Kim's response was evasive and unconvincing, focusing on general statements about commercial strategy rather than specific justifications for choosing PharmaCorp Solutions as a licensing partner. His inability to provide clear explanations for the planned transfer strengthened our argument that the deal was motivated by personal relationships rather than legitimate business considerations. Furthermore, Judge Sullivan continued, what is your client's response to allegations that CEO Jonathan Blackwood holds personal financial interests in the receiving company, creating potential conflicts of interest that should have been disclosed to shareholders and regulatory authorities? This question struck at the heart of our expanded legal strategy. Henderson had uncovered evidence of Blackwood's personal investment in PharmaCorp Solutions, creating clear conflicts of interest that violated basic principles of corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility. Corporate executives who used their positions to enrich companies in which they held personal interests were exposing their employers to significant legal liability and potential criminal prosecution. Kim's response to questions about conflict of interest was even more evasive than his previous answers, suggesting that Meridian Technologies was unprepared for legal challenges that extended beyond simple patent ownership disputes. Their strategy had apparently been based on the assumption that a terminated employee would lack the resources and determination to pursue comprehensive legal action against corporate misconduct. The hearing continued for over 3 hours, with both sides presenting technical evidence and legal arguments, while Judge Sullivan asked increasingly detailed questions about patent development processes and corporate decision-making procedures. Her focus on the qualifications of PharmaCorp Solutions and the suspicious timing of my termination suggested that she was skeptical of Meridian's claims and concerned about the potential consequences of allowing questionable patent transfers to proceed. Based on the evidence presented, Judge Sullivan announced as the hearing concluded, I am granting the emergency injunction, preventing any transfer of the Chen Protocol patents, while ownership disputes remain unresolved. The documented evidence of Dr. Chen's role in developing these innovations, combined with questions about the legitimacy of the planned transfer to PharmaCorp Solutions, creates sufficient doubt about Meridian Technologies' ownership claims to warrant judicial intervention. The injunction was a significant victory that validated our legal strategy and bought crucial time for pursuing comprehensive challenges to Meridian's intellectual property claims. More importantly, Judge Sullivan's pointed questions about corporate governance and conflict of interest issues suggested that our case had attracted the kind of judicial attention that could expose the entire pattern of misconduct at Meridian Technologies. Henderson was clearly pleased with the outcome as we gathered our materials and prepared to leave the courthouse. Dr. Chen, he said quietly, this is exactly the result we hoped for. Judge Sullivan's questions about conflict of interest and corporate governance indicate that she's willing to look beyond simple patent ownership issues to examine the broader implications of what Meridian Technologies is attempting to do. The legal victory was immediately followed by developments that would expand our case in directions I hadn't fully anticipated. Dr. Patricia Valdez approached me in the courthouse corridor with information that would fundamentally change the scope of our legal strategy and the potential consequences for Meridian Technologies executives. Sarah, Valdez said, consulting notes she had apparently been reluctant to share until the injunction was secured. There are 3 other researchers who have been documenting similar patterns of misconduct at Meridian Technologies. They're prepared to provide testimony and evidence about systematic theft of intellectual property that extends back over 5 years. This revelation transformed our case from an individual dispute into evidence of criminal conspiracy that could attract federal investigation and prosecution. If Meridian Technologies had been engaging in systematic theft of employee intellectual property, transferring valuable patents to companies with connections to senior executives, it represented the kind of corporate crime that federal prosecutors pursued aggressively. Patricia, are these researchers willing to coordinate their legal actions with our case? I asked, recognizing that multiple plaintiffs with similar claims would create enormous pressure on Meridian Technologies and could result in class action litigation that would be devastating for the company. Absolutely, Valdez replied without hesitation. Dr. Michael Ross had his cancer research patents transferred to a company owned by former Meridian executive James Peterson. Dr. Linda Chang lost her cardiovascular innovations to another company with suspicious connections to current board members. Dr. Robert Williams was terminated after developing breakthrough neurological treatments that were subsequently licensed to a company that paid far below market rates. The pattern of misconduct was extensive and well documented, suggesting that Meridian Technologies had been operating a systematic scheme to steal employee intellectual property for the benefit of corporate executives and their personal associates. This evidence would allow our legal team to pursue not just civil litigation but criminal referrals that could result in federal prosecution and massive financial penalties. Henderson was immediately interested in coordinating with other affected researchers to build a comprehensive case that would expose the entire scope of corporate corruption at Meridian Technologies. Chen, he said, if we can document systematic misconduct affecting multiple researchers, we'll be able to pursue RICO violations and conspiracy charges that could result in criminal prosecution of responsible executives. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was designed specifically to address systematic criminal activity within corporations and other organizations. If we could demonstrate that Meridian Technologies executives had engaged in a pattern of intellectual property theft for personal enrichment, it would constitute exactly the kind of organized criminal activity that RICO was intended to prosecute. Over the next several days, I worked closely with Henderson's firm and the other affected researchers to compile evidence of systematic misconduct that painted a devastating picture of corporate corruption at Meridian Technologies. The documentation revealed a pattern of terminating researchers shortly before valuable patents were ready for commercialization, then transferring those patents to companies with connections to Meridian executives at prices far below market value. The scope of the theft was staggering. Combined, the researchers had developed innovations worth over $2 billion in potential licensing revenue. Yet these patents had been transferred to connected companies for total payments of less than $50 million. The difference represented hundreds of millions of dollars in lost value to Meridian Technologies shareholders and stolen intellectual property that should have benefited the inventors who developed these breakthrough technologies. Dr. Michael Ross had developed revolutionary cancer treatments that were showing unprecedented success in clinical trials when his employment was terminated for alleged performance issues that were clearly fabricated. His patents were subsequently transferred to Oncology Solutions, a company owned by James Peterson, who had been Meridian's chief technology officer until accepting a lucrative position with his new pharmaceutical company. Dr. Linda Chang had created innovative cardiovascular treatments that could prevent heart attacks and strokes in high-risk patients, but her research was characterized as commercially unviable just months before clinical trials demonstrated remarkable effectiveness. Her patents were transferred to Cardiopharm Technologies, a company whose board included 3 former Meridian executives, and whose licensing terms were so favorable that they essentially constituted gifts of valuable intellectual property. Dr. Robert Williams had developed breakthrough treatments for Alzheimer's disease and other neurological disorders, innovations that represented decades of research and could benefit millions of patients suffering from devastating conditions. His termination was justified by budget constraints that were mysteriously resolved immediately after his patents were transferred to Neuromed Solutions at licensing rates that were less than 10% of conservative market valuations. The pattern was unmistakable and systematic. Meridian Technologies had been operating what amounted to an intellectual property theft ring, terminating researchers and transferring their innovations to companies owned or controlled by current and former executives. The scheme had generated enormous personal wealth for the participants while depriving legitimate inventors of the recognition and compensation they deserved for their breakthrough discoveries. Henderson's firm immediately began preparing criminal referrals to federal prosecutors, while also coordinating with attorneys representing the other affected researchers to pursue comprehensive civil litigation that would seek both monetary damages and criminal prosecution of responsible executives. The evidence was sufficiently compelling to attract attention from federal agencies that specialized in corporate crime and white-collar prosecution. Dr. Chen, Henderson said during our strategy meeting following the initial evidence compilation, what we've uncovered represents one of the most extensive intellectual property theft schemes I've encountered in 25 years of patent litigation. The criminal implications alone could result in decades of prison sentences for the executives involved. The criminal potential of our case was both personally satisfying and strategically advantageous. Corporate executives who engaged in systematic theft were often more concerned about criminal prosecution than civil litigation, since criminal convictions could result in prison sentences and permanent damage to personal reputations that extended far beyond financial penalties. But the most significant development in our expanding legal strategy came from an unexpected source. FBI Special Agent Maria Rodriguez contacted Henderson's firm with information suggesting that federal authorities had been investigating Meridian Technologies for potential securities fraud and corporate corruption, making our intellectual property theft evidence particularly valuable for a broader criminal investigation. Mr. Henderson, Agent Rodriguez explained during a confidential meeting at the federal building, the FBI has been monitoring suspicious financial transactions between Meridian Technologies and various pharmaceutical companies for over 18 months. The evidence your clients have provided about systematic patent transfers fills significant gaps in our investigation and could be crucial for establishing criminal conspiracy charges. The federal investigation was far more extensive than any of us had anticipated, involving multiple agencies and focusing on potential violations of securities law, tax regulations, and federal anti-corruption statutes. Our intellectual property theft case was becoming part of a broader criminal investigation that could result in federal prosecution of Meridian Technologies executives and massive financial penalties for the company. Agent Rodriguez, Henderson replied, our clients are prepared to cooperate fully with federal investigation and provide whatever testimony or documentation would be helpful for criminal prosecution. The theft of their intellectual property represents not just personal injury, but systematic corruption that threatens the integrity of scientific research and medical innovation. The FBI's interest in our case created new opportunities and challenges for our legal strategy. Federal criminal investigation provided resources and authority that could expose evidence unavailable through civil litigation, but it also meant that our clients would be subject to extensive scrutiny and potential testimony requirements that could extend for years. More importantly, federal investigation meant that Meridian Technologies executives would face criminal prosecution that could result in prison sentences and permanent disgrace, consequences far more severe than the civil penalties and financial damages they had apparently anticipated when designing their intellectual property theft scheme. The prospect of criminal prosecution was already creating pressure on Meridian Technologies that was visible through industry networks and corporate behavior. Several senior executives had retained personal criminal defense attorneys, and the company's board of directors had initiated an internal investigation that suggested they were beginning to understand the scope of potential legal liability they faced. Jonathan Blackwood's behavior was particularly revealing. According to industry sources, he had canceled planned business trips and was avoiding public appearances at conferences and professional events where he might encounter questions about the federal investigation. His golf games with Michael Harrison had apparently been suspended, and PharmaCorp Solutions had quietly withdrawn from several licensing negotiations that might attract regulatory attention. The transformation in corporate behavior was exactly what Henderson had predicted when powerful executives faced the prospect of criminal prosecution rather than routine civil litigation. Dr. Chen, he observed, corporate criminals often maintain their arrogance until they realize that federal prosecutors are involved. Once they understand that their personal freedom is at stake, they become much more reasonable about settlement negotiations. But settlement was no longer my primary objective. The systematic theft of intellectual property at Meridian Technologies represented an assault on scientific innovation and medical research that demanded criminal prosecution and permanent consequences for the executives responsible. My personal goal had evolved from protecting my individual patents to exposing an entire system of corporate corruption that threatened the integrity of biotech research. The NIH research opportunity that Dr. Torres had introduced was proceeding simultaneously with the legal action, providing me with career security and scientific resources that would allow me to continue my research regardless of the outcome of patent disputes. Dr. Jennifer Kim had confirmed that federal research positions carried protections against corporate retaliation and could provide platforms for independent investigation that wouldn't be subject to commercial pressures or intellectual property restrictions. Dr. Kim said during our final interview for the NIH position, "Your experience with corporate intellectual property disputes makes you particularly valuable for our research program. We need investigators who understand both the scientific and legal complexities of bringing breakthrough medical treatments to market through proper regulatory channels." The NIH appointment would provide multi-year funding for continuing research into autoimmune treatments, with full intellectual property protections, and the kind of institutional support that would allow me to pursue scientific goals without concern for corporate interference. More importantly, it would demonstrate to federal prosecutors and the biotech community that legitimate institutions valued my research and recognized the importance of protecting intellectual property rights. Accepting the federal research position also sent a clear message to Meridian Technologies that their theft of my patents hadn't destroyed my career or eliminated me as a threat to their corrupt activities. Instead, their misconduct had elevated me to a more prominent position with greater resources and federal protection that would make me far more dangerous as an adversary than I had ever been as an employee. The strategic implications of my NIH appointment were immediately apparent to Henderson and the other attorneys working on our case. Dr. Chen, Henderson observed, "Having federal employment provides you with both credibility and protection that will be valuable for criminal prosecution testimony. Meridian Technologies can't characterize you as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge when you're clearly succeeding in your career despite their attempts to damage you." As the legal case expanded and the federal investigation intensified, I began receiving contact from journalists and industry publications interested in covering the intellectual property theft scandal at Meridian Technologies. The story was attracting attention, not just because of the financial scope of the theft, but because it represented systematic corruption that threatened the integrity of medical research and innovation. Businessweek reporter Jennifer Walsh contacted me with questions about the broader implications of corporate intellectual property theft and its impact on scientific research and patient welfare. "Dr. Chen," Walsh said, "your case appears to represent a pattern of misconduct that could affect the entire biotech industry. Are you concerned that other companies might be engaging in similar practices?" The media attention was both personally validating and strategically advantageous for our legal case. Public scrutiny of corporate intellectual property theft would create additional pressure on Meridian Technologies executives and could encourage other affected researchers to come forward with evidence of similar misconduct at other companies. "Ms. Walsh," I replied, "the systematic theft of intellectual property threatens the entire foundation of scientific innovation and medical research. Researchers who spend decades developing breakthrough treatments deserve recognition and compensation for their discoveries, and patients who could benefit from these innovations deserve to know that they're being developed properly by qualified companies." The interview was published as a cover story that attracted widespread attention throughout the biotech community and generated additional media interest in the systematic corruption at Meridian Technologies. The public exposure was creating exactly the kind of pressure that Henderson had predicted would be most effective for forcing accountability and ensuring criminal prosecution. More importantly, The media coverage was encouraging other researchers to contact federal investigators with evidence of similar misconduct at other companies, suggesting that the Meridian Technologies case was exposing industry-wide problems that could result in comprehensive regulatory reform and criminal prosecution. The woman who had been casually dismissed from Meridian Technologies 3 months earlier was now leading a federal investigation that threatened to expose systematic corruption throughout the biotech industry while pursuing breakthrough medical research under federal protection. Jonathan Blackwood's assumption that terminating my employment would eliminate me as a threat had proven to be the most catastrophic miscalculation of his corrupt career. The flash of cameras outside the federal courthouse was blinding, as FBI agents led Jonathan Blackwood and 3 other Meridian Technologies executives through the media gauntlet toward waiting vehicles that would transport them to federal detention facilities. I watched from the courthouse steps alongside Henderson and the other researchers who had spent 8 months building the case that had culminated in this moment of justice, feeling a profound sense of vindication that extended far beyond personal satisfaction to encompass something larger about scientific integrity and corporate accountability. The federal grand jury had issued indictments on 17 counts of conspiracy, securities fraud, tax evasion, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, with potential sentences that could result in decades of imprisonment for executives who had believed their theft of intellectual property would never face serious consequences. The systematic nature of their crimes had attracted attention from multiple federal agencies, transforming what had begun as my individual patent dispute into one of the largest corporate corruption cases in biotech industry history. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez approached our group as the media attention began to focus on other aspects of the federal investigation, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had spent months methodically building a case against executives who had assumed their positions would protect them from criminal prosecution. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I wanted to personally thank you and the other researchers for your cooperation throughout this investigation. Your willingness to provide testimony and documentation made it possible to expose the full scope of the conspiracy at Meridian Technologies." The federal investigation had revealed corruption that extended far beyond the intellectual property theft we had initially uncovered. Meridian Technologies executives had been operating multiple schemes designed to enrich themselves and their associates at the expense of shareholders, employees, and the patients who could have benefited from properly developed medical innovations. The financial scope of their crimes exceeded $3 billion in stolen value, while the human cost included delayed or abandoned treatments that could have saved countless lives. Agent Rodriguez continued her briefing as we moved away from the media crowds. The asset forfeiture proceedings will begin next week, which means that all properties and financial accounts derived from criminal activity will be seized and liquidated to provide restitution for victims. The Chen Protocol and all other stolen patents will be returned to their rightful inventors, along with compensation for lost licensing revenues and development opportunities. The financial restitution was substantial and personally meaningful, but more importantly, it meant that my revolutionary autoimmune treatment would finally be developed properly by qualified companies, rather than being corrupted by the incompetent associates of criminal executives. The Chen Protocol had continued showing remarkable results in clinical trials, with patients experiencing unprecedented improvement in conditions that had been considered incurable just months earlier. Dr. Patricia Valdez had been monitoring the clinical development of our various stolen innovations, and her reports indicated that proper scientific oversight was already producing better results than would have been possible under the corrupt licensing arrangements that Meridian executives had planned. "Sarah," she said as we gathered for lunch following the court proceedings, "the patients who are benefiting from your treatment protocol are experiencing quality of life improvements that exceed our most optimistic projections. This is what happens when medical research is developed by scientists rather than criminals." The personal transformation I had undergone during the months of legal battle was as profound as the professional vindication we had achieved through criminal prosecution. The woman who had been casually dismissed from Meridian Technologies had evolved into someone who understood corporate power dynamics and federal investigation procedures with the same precision she applied to complex biochemical research. More importantly, I had discovered capabilities for strategic thinking and coalition building that had been dormant during my years of focusing exclusively on laboratory investigation. Henderson's firm had handled the legal complexities with exceptional skill, but the broader implications of our case had required me to develop expertise in areas I had never previously considered. Media relations, federal cooperation procedures, and coordination with multiple research institutions had demanded abilities that extended far beyond scientific training. Yet I had found myself surprisingly effective at managing these complex relationships and strategic considerations. The NIH research position had provided both professional security and institutional credibility throughout the criminal investigation, while also offering resources for continuing autoimmune research that exceeded anything available in corporate environments. Dr. Jennifer Kim had been remarkably supportive during the months when my testimony requirements conflicted with research schedules, understanding that exposing corporate corruption was ultimately beneficial for the scientific community and federal research priorities. Dr. Kim said during our post-trial meeting at the NIH facility in Bethesda, "Your experience with intellectual property protection has made you invaluable for our research program and for training other investigators about the legal complexities of bringing medical innovations to market. We're prepared to offer you permanent tenure and expanded funding for your autoimmune research program." The offer represented career security and scientific resources that would allow me to pursue breakthrough medical research without concern for corporate interference or intellectual property disputes. More importantly, it provided a platform for mentoring other researchers about protecting their innovations and recognizing the warning signs of corporate misconduct that could threaten their work. The broader impact of our legal victory was already visible throughout the biotech industry, where companies were implementing new policies designed to prevent the kind of intellectual property theft that had been systematically practiced at Meridian Technologies. Professional organizations were developing guidelines for protecting researcher rights, while federal agencies were increasing oversight of patent transfers and licensing agreements that involved companies with connections to corporate executives. Dr. Michael Torres had been tracking these industry changes through his network of academic and corporate contacts, and his reports suggested that our case had fundamentally altered how biotech companies approached intellectual property management and researcher relations. "Sarah," he said during a conference call that included several prominent researchers, "what you accomplished at Meridian Technologies has created precedents that will protect scientists throughout the industry for decades to come." The precedential value of criminal prosecution for intellectual property theft was particularly significant because it demonstrated that federal authorities were willing to pursue criminal charges against corporate executives who engaged in systematic theft of employee innovations. Previous cases had typically been resolved through civil litigation that resulted in financial penalties, but no personal consequences for responsible executives. But our case had established that systematic intellectual property theft constituted criminal conspiracy that could result in decades of imprisonment and permanent destruction of executive careers. This precedent would deter future misconduct while encouraging researchers to report suspicious activities that might indicate corporate corruption. The media coverage of the criminal convictions had attracted international attention to the broader issues of intellectual property protection and corporate accountability in scientific research. Business publications throughout Europe and Asia were examining their own biotech industries for evidence of similar misconduct, while regulatory agencies were implementing new oversight procedures designed to prevent the kind of systematic theft that had been exposed at Meridian Technologies. Jennifer Walsh's follow-up articles for Businessweek had documented the global implications of our case and the regulatory reforms that were being implemented to protect intellectual property rights in scientific research. "Dr. Chen," she said during our final interview, "your willingness to challenge corporate corruption has created changes that extend far beyond your individual situation to benefit researchers and patients worldwide." The global impact was personally gratifying and professionally meaningful, representing the kind of systematic change that could protect future innovations and ensure that breakthrough medical treatments reached patients through legitimate channels rather than being corrupted by criminal enterprises disguised as pharmaceutical companies. PharmaCorp Solutions had collapsed within weeks of the federal indictments, as investors fled and regulatory agencies suspended all licensing agreements pending investigation of the company's relationship with convicted criminals. Michael Harrison had been named as an unindicted co-conspirator and faced civil litigation that would likely result in personal bankruptcy and permanent prohibition from participating in pharmaceutical development. The destruction of Harrison's company was particularly satisfying because it demonstrated that corporate criminals couldn't simply transfer stolen assets to associate companies and expect to avoid consequences for their crimes. Federal asset forfeiture procedures had seized all properties and financial accounts that were derived from criminal activity, while civil litigation was pursuing additional damages that would ensure complete accountability for the theft of intellectual property. Meridian Technologies itself had been purchased by Johnson & Johnson in a bankruptcy proceeding that provided some compensation for shareholders, while ensuring that legitimate research projects would be continued under proper scientific oversight. The acquisition had been structured to exclude any executives who had participated in the criminal conspiracy, while providing employment protection for researchers and technical staff who had been victimized by the intellectual property theft scheme. The new management at the restructured company had contacted me about potential consulting arrangements that would allow me to provide guidance about autoimmune research development, while maintaining my primary position with the NIH. Dr. Chen, said Dr. Amanda Foster, the new Chief Scientific Officer, we're committed to rebuilding Meridian Technologies as a company that respects intellectual property rights and supports scientific innovation rather than exploiting it for criminal purposes. The consulting opportunity was attractive both financially and professionally, representing recognition from legitimate pharmaceutical companies that my expertise was valuable and that my experience with corporate corruption had enhanced rather than damaged my scientific credibility. More importantly, it provided opportunities to influence how breakthrough medical research was developed and commercialized in ways that would benefit both inventors and patients. The Chen Protocol had been licensed to 3 major pharmaceutical companies under terms that provided substantial royalty payments, while ensuring that clinical development would proceed according to the highest scientific and ethical standards. The licensing revenues would fund expanded research into autoimmune treatments while providing financial security that would allow me to pursue scientific goals without concern for immediate commercial considerations. Sarah, said Dr. Elizabeth Warren during our celebration dinner at a restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, what you've accomplished represents one of the most significant victories for researcher rights in the history of biotech intellectual property law. But more importantly, you've demonstrated that scientists can fight back against corporate corruption and win comprehensive victories that protect both individual rights and scientific integrity. The personal satisfaction of achieving justice was matched by the professional recognition I had gained throughout the biotech community and federal research establishment. Invitations to speak at conferences and participate in policy discussions had established me as an expert not just in autoimmune research, but also in intellectual property protection and corporate accountability and scientific innovation. The speaking engagements provided platforms for educating other researchers about protecting their innovations and recognizing warning signs of corporate misconduct that could threaten their work. Dr. Chen, said Dr. Robert Martinez, the conference organizer for the American Society of Biotech Researchers, your experience has made you uniquely qualified to help other scientists understand both the opportunities and the risks associated with corporate research relationships. These educational activities represented natural extensions of my scientific career that allowed me to contribute to researcher protection and industry integrity while continuing breakthrough medical research. The combination of technical expertise and legal experience had created career opportunities that were more diverse and influential than anything I had imagined during my years of focusing exclusively on laboratory investigation. The personal relationships that had been damaged during my corporate employment were gradually being restored, as friends and colleagues recognized that my legal battle had been motivated by principles rather than personal vindictiveness. Dr. Kevin Park, a former Meridian colleague who had initially been skeptical of my claims, contacted me with an apology and information about additional misconduct he had observed but hadn't previously reported. Sarah, Kevin said during our reconciliation meeting, I want you to know that your courage in challenging Meridian Technologies has inspired other researchers to speak up about problems they were afraid to report. You've created an environment where scientists feel protected when they expose corporate corruption instead of feeling threatened by potential retaliation. The cultural change within the scientific community was one of the most meaningful outcomes of our legal victory. Researchers who had previously felt powerless against corporate misconduct now understood that federal law provided protections, and that criminal prosecution was possible when companies engaged in systematic theft of intellectual property. The 2-year anniversary of my termination from Meridian Technologies was marked by a symposium on intellectual property protection that brought together researchers, attorneys, and federal officials to discuss the ongoing implications of our case and the regulatory reforms that had been implemented to prevent similar misconduct. I was invited to deliver the keynote address about the importance of researcher courage in challenging corporate corruption. Standing before an audience of several hundred scientists and policymakers, I reflected on the journey that had transformed me from a dismissed employee into someone who had exposed systematic criminal conspiracy and created precedents that would protect researchers for decades to come. The woman who had been escorted from Meridian Technologies with a small box of personal belongings had evolved into someone who understood that scientific excellence and legal determination could overcome even the most sophisticated corporate corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my address. 2 years ago, I discovered that my life's work was being stolen by executives who believed that terminating my employment would eliminate me as a threat to their criminal enterprise. They were wrong about that, just as they were wrong about everything else. Scientists who create breakthrough innovations possess capabilities that extend far beyond laboratory research. And when we combine scientific precision with legal determination, we become forces that corporate criminals cannot anticipate or defeat. The audience response was enthusiastic and sustained, reflecting recognition that our case had created opportunities for researcher empowerment that extended throughout the scientific community. More importantly, the symposium provided platforms for continuing education about intellectual property protection and corporate accountability that would help other researchers avoid the exploitation I had experienced. As I concluded my remarks and prepared to return to my research laboratory for an afternoon of investigating new approaches to autoimmune treatment, I felt profound satisfaction about both the justice we had achieved and the scientific work that continued to benefit patients worldwide. The Chen Protocol was helping thousands of people recover from conditions that had been considered incurable, while the legal precedents we had established were protecting researchers from corporate corruption throughout the biotech industry. The transformation was complete and permanent. The woman who had been casually dismissed by Jonathan Blackwood had become someone far more dangerous and influential than any corporate executive could imagine. And unlike their criminal enterprise, my success was built on scientific excellence and ethical principles that would continue generating benefits for patients and researchers long after their corruption had been forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.